Yep. Where's this clip? I got it.
Got it?
Put that there. There we go.
All right, all set? All right, let's try this again. So I was asked to give one of the presentations on Russia to try to give you a sense of Russia's geopolitical and geoeconomic strategies, and that's what I'll do momentarily. But first, before we talk about Russian strategies, I wanted to give a sense of putting Russia into current context. Where is it today? How does it play in the world? And how do we, on this side of the world, look and evaluate Russia? So a few weeks ago, I happened to be down in New York at the Council on Foreign Relations. They convened a working group on what they think Russian foreign policy is going to be like for the coming years. What I like about going to New York is it's a nice mix because the policy people come up from Washington, but New York has the money people. New York has the investors, the fund managers, the people that are looking at the profit side of the ledger. And so whenever you have the policy and the money people together in the same room on Russia, it's quite interesting because you can really see the divergence. So the policy people come up, and they were there, and probably some of the things you may have heard. If you've heard some of these expressions about Russia in the last number of years, you know, if they sound familiar. So for example, have you heard the phrase, Russia is just a big gas station? Upper Volta with missiles used to be a more popular one. Russia's not doing well, it's in decline. They're going to lose people. It's not a very stable place, and yes, there's some activity that's taking place that's worrying us, but the long-term trends don't look good. And I was sitting next to someone at this event from one of the major banks who was shaking his head at various points as former assistant secretaries and special assistants to the president were pontificating about Russia. And he would be sitting there and he's saying, yeah, that's great for you Washington people to think this, but this is what we in New York are looking at. So I throw this up and ask you, does this look like a place you might want to put some money in? Standard & Poor's looks at the debt offerings of this country's government and has just raised it to positive. Moody's keeps it at stable, but both of the rating services say this is a good place to put money in the bonds of this government. You're likely to not only safeguard your capital, but get a good return. The top 13 companies, S&P gives a positive. You should buy. GDP, 1.5 to 2% growth for 2017. Maybe that's not Chinese level of 8%, but that's pretty good. If you were invested in the index fund in 2016, you got a 51.7% return. The equivalent one for the US was 26%. So if you were invested in the standard US index fund for last year, you got 26% back. If you were invested in this country's index fund, you got a return that was a little more than double. Country's labor needs makes it the third country in the world in terms of receiving immigrants. So people are going there because there's a labor market, there's a demand. The economy is sending out demand signals, and so people are going there to work because it's a place to work. So only the United States and the European Union are higher in terms of receiving immigrants into their economies. Fund managers look at and say there's 5 key areas of growth: natural resource extraction and processing, infrastructure, agriculture, consumer goods, and the service sector. Not only to invest in those businesses there, but also that American firms that provide goods and services that support this sector are going to find a growing market. Caterpillar, for instance. If you're dealing with a country that looks to be rejuvenating its infrastructure, it's going to be building more roads, more railroads, pipelines and the like, and you need equipment. Probably Caterpillar is a good buy and probably wants to be there. In the capital city, one of the world's top 3 in terms of infrastructure development. So this is the assessment that people in New York on Wall Street and related areas have about Russia in 2017. It's a different view than the view in Washington. So if you listen to people on the Hill, if you've been following the hearings, it's Russia doom and gloom, Russia's a bad place. New York is, we need to get back into this market. We have money that needs to go somewhere. This looks like a good place to put it. Maybe we should think about it. So it raises some interesting questions as we move forward for policy, which is if you have a divergence between Wall Street and Capitol Hill, how long does that divergence remain? And Wall Street definitely is signaling it wants to go back into Russia. American companies want to go back. We may have sanctions. And the question is our sanctions going to be enforced, or are people going to find ways around the sanctions because there's money to be made? So I wanted to set this as an overall stage for discussing Russia today, because it is quite telling to see this juxtaposition, to sit in a room and to have 2 very different views of the same country being expressed by people who are on the policy, security side of the House versus people who are looking at this from the investment side of the House. All right, so with that, my mandate for today is to work through Russia's geopolitical and geoeconomic strategies moving forward. Give my usual disclaimer, these are going to be my views. They certainly don't necessarily reflect the views of the Navy, Department of Defense, or of the administration. Also, as I often tell my students in class, when I give a presentation, I sometimes feel it's important not just to give you what I think, but to channel what I think the key people are. So at various points in this presentation, I'm going to try to channel not what I think or what I believe is good or right, but what people in the Kremlin are thinking is good and right for Russia, what their viewpoints are. Their viewpoint may not necessarily be my viewpoint, but it's important for me to give you an accurate picture of not what I think the Kremlin should be doing, but to tell you what the Kremlin thinks it ought to be doing and why it's pursuing the strategies that it is moving forward. I also have the benefit of having been in Moscow in February. It was part of the first large Track 2 dialogue, U.S.-Russia dialogue, that was convened since the Trump administration took office. This was the first effort to try to discuss questions of how the U.S.-Russia relationship might or might not evolve under the changed circumstances of a new administration. Some of that is worked into this, and certainly in the Q&A I'm happy to give you my impressions. Certainly some of those economic impressions. We were in Moscow, which of course is only one city, but certainly saw a lot of construction, which bolstered that assessment of Moscow as one of the top 3 infrastructure developments for a country that politicians were saying was on the ropes because of sanctions. There's a lot of construction going on, there's a lot of business, there's a lot of activity, and so as one of these persons in New York kind of said, sanctions may have looked good for politicians, but to impose them, but from the economic side, what we may have done was just simply trimmed off some of the fat, and Russian companies got a little bit better in how they spent and how they were borrowing, and they may come out of sanctions if and when sanctions are lifted leaner and in a better position, because what we've essentially perhaps done with our sanctions over the last 3 years is to kill off the bad producers, and the survivors will be, in terms of the firms, and the companies will be in a better position. All right, so first is the geopolitical side of the House. And 3 years ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and those that were here last year, I gave the kind of walkthrough on, Putin the man, trying to get, his experiences, his background, what makes him tick. This speech he gave 3 years ago, we're coming up on the 3rd anniversary of when he delivered this speech to the Federal Assembly. A very underappreciated speech, unfortunately, in American analytic circles. because it really expressed a lot about his worldview and his view about geopolitics. And he used the expression of a spring. And he said, when you compress a spring, the more you compress it, at some point that spring bounces back. And his point was that, in his view, the West had been compressing on Russia over the last 20 years, and now the spring is poised to snap back. And so when we look at what Russia has been doing in the Baltic Basin, in the Black Sea, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, is starting to say, we're putting markers down. We're putting geopolitical markers down of no more. Here are the lines, and we, the Kremlin, Russia, will raise your costs. If you think you can operate in these theaters with impunity, we will show you that the costs can be increased substantially. We will, the ability, of course, to take Crimea. Oops, where's the laser pointer part? There. The Crimea brought back into the Russian fold effectively now gives Russia the ability to control the Black Sea. What they've been doing in the Kaliningrad Oblast and all along their western frontiers is to make the eastern Baltic a bit of a no-go zone, or at least if the West wants to operate there, to realize that there would be costs. And then, of course, the intervention in the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean has been to reestablish a Russian position there. Russia reestablishing, after a hiatus of a few months, of a new growing strategic partnership with Turkey, also is changing the game. And as we're going to see shortly, some of the Russian moves in the Middle East, which link their geopolitical and geoeconomic strategies together, are attempts to change the balance. And what this is to say is that you cannot discount Russia. The Kremlin has been very consistent over the last 20 years in what it has been saying it wants out of the world, ever since the second term of the Yeltsin administration. And that is a world where Russia is a player, Russia is consulted, Russia simply does not have a voice, where Russia says something and the United States says, thank you very much, we'll take that under advisement. But a world order where Russia says, here's our list of demands. We know you, the United States, are still the preeminent power. Yes, you are the chairman of the board, but we are one of the vice chairmen of the board, and we have a right to bring things to the table and for you to take those into account. So whether it's what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Georgia, what happens in the Middle East, what happens in the Balkans, the idea that Russia has interests and that they want to show that they can protect their clients and their interests and that we have to take them into account. And if we don't, they can raise costs for us and make things more difficult for us. So this is what's occurring. When we put it on the larger sense of what the Russians have been doing, it is this idea that Europe, the Euro-Atlantic world, grew after the Cold War. So obviously we remember that at 1989, this was effectively the dividing line here. The Russians accept that this dividing line has moved. They're not trying to reverse it back to here. But first of all, two things. One, the line stops here. No further east. Europe, the European world ends at the Vistula. And the second is that, yes, this may be part of the Euro-Atlantic world, but Russia still has interests that need to be taken into account. The governments of these regions have to take Russia's interests into account, and the Western European allies and us across the pond have to not give blank checks to the governments here to say, hey, whatever you want vis-a-vis Russia, we back you up because you're part of our alliance. It's nope, you're going to have to negotiate. You're going to have to accommodate. Same thing also with the Middle East, that Russia says, we're not looking to take over the Middle East, but we would like to have a say in how the Middle East is settled. We have interests. We have clients. It is not a, here's what was decided in Washington and now is what will happen in the region. It's, nope, Washington proposes, Moscow proposes, then you sit down and you find something where both sides have to agree, both sides have to compromise. And again, if the United States doesn't want to do this, then Russia says we can make it more expensive for you, more difficult for you. Geoeconomically, so shifting now a bit to the business side. The Russians have made, over the last several years, a new commitment. They are not going to allow their economic relations with their most critical partners in Europe to run through Eastern Europe anymore. For the last 20 years, the US and EU strategy for managing Central and East Europe was to try to create a three-sided partnership where Russia, the European Union as a whole, and the Central and East European states in particular would all have to be integrated together in order for Russian energy and other things to be able to travel from east to west. The Russians have decided, they've made it a strategic goal that by 2019, and we'll see some further maps in a minute, by 2019 they want no energy to transit Ukraine to European markets. That the idea that Ukraine is a transit country, that Russia has to pay Ukraine for transit rights, that this gives Ukraine influence over Russia by saying, well, if you don't want, we can cut off your energy from reaching Western markets. The Russian strategy now is to have no energy transit through Ukraine by 2019. The way that they are going to do this, two things. One is they already have an existing pipeline which runs from Russia to Germany, Nord Stream 1. They're looking to build a second pipeline that will double that capacity so that Russia can directly ship energy to Germany without it having to go through any troublesome partners further east. This is also essentially to pitch to Germany that, hey, Germany, you like having secure energy supplies. Do you want your energy security to depend upon Russia's relations with Ukraine or with other countries to the east? Do you want your energy security to be held hostage to whether or not Russia gets along with her neighbors? The European Commission has had some issues. Poland last year filed a complaint with the European Commission saying that the doubling of Nord Stream would have an injurious effect on energy competition in Europe. But the pipeline project is moving ahead. There's a consortium of companies, European and Russian, seeking to move this project forward. And the goal is to have this line built within the next several years so that Russia can send all of Germany's energy needs, and then by extension to other parts of Europe, directly from Russia to Germany through the Baltic coast. So as you can see, this idea of Ukraine being a critical energy connector, Russia is looking now to say, for 20 years, we lived with that, we tried to work with it, it's no longer in our strategic interests, we don't want to be dependent upon Ukraine, so we want to find other ways to do it. We may or may not. Russia says, look, we don't know how our relationship with Belarus will end up. We've had problems in our relationship with Poland, so we also want to have the option of not having to use the route through Belarus there, the Yamal line that then goes through Poland. So if everything can go from these routes to Nord Stream, and then you can reconnect to all of your Central and West European markets so that Russia does not need to cut deals or compromise with transit states, so Ukraine, potentially Belarus, Poland, and others. So this is a geoeconomic strategy that is meant to yield geopolitical results. Then we've come into the other part of this equation, which is the southern route. Because even if you double the Nord Stream capacity, it doesn't completely remove the transit states from the equation. It also makes it more difficult to supply your customers in southern Europe. So the southern route needs to be established. The original plan a few years ago was to build a pipeline from Russia to Bulgaria, and then the gas would go from Bulgaria into other parts of Europe. The European Commission scuppered that project in 2014 on the grounds, again, of competition, that it violated the third energy package, that a supplier of energy cannot also own the means by which that energy is supplied to market. So the third package requires that the supplier of energy not be the owner, and or that the pipeline or infrastructure that's being used has to be open to other energy companies to use. Russia instead then said, fine, then we will explore. If we can't get into Bulgaria because of EU rules, then we'll build a line and we'll have it come into Turkey. Turkey is not a European Union member, so the third energy package does not apply. And then once the gas gets to Turkey, Turkey will use some of it. Turkey is a growing economy. Turkey's appetite for energy has been growing by leaps and bounds over the last 20 years. Both gas, nuclear energy, so the Russians are building nuclear plants now for Turkey so that Turkey can have an indigenous nuclear power production capability. And then you will build an interconnector that will connect Turkey to the EU, and so Russian gas goes to Turkey, and then it's piped into the interconnector, and then it can go to other markets. This can then tie into gas that is envisioned to be coming from Azerbaijan as well for European consumption, and then all these networks are tied together. Turkey likes it because then Turkey becomes an energy hub for Europe. If you have energy from Russia, Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, and potentially from Israel, all coming to Turkey, and then Turkey is the point at which it enters the European market, then Turkey becomes indispensable to the EU as well for its energy. So the Turks are very pleased to see these projects move on. These plans were initially interrupted when the Turks had shot down the Russian fighter in November of 2015 that had for about a minute or so penetrated Turkish airspace from Syria. Interesting side note on this. When we talk about effectiveness of sanctions and we look at our sanctions on Russia for Crimea, for Ukraine, and we say, well, how effective have they been? The Russian sanctions on Turkey are the most recent example of sanctions that actually work. So when the Turks shot down the Russian airplane, everyone said, oh, well, is Russia going to respond militarily? Russia didn't respond militarily, it responded economically. And it took about 6 months for the impact of the Russian sanctions to hurt Turkey so much that the Turkish government reversed course, suddenly discovered that the pilot who shot down the Russian airline was connected with the coup plotters retroactively, that he was a secret Gulenist who shot down the Russian plane. The Turks apologized and got, wanted the Russian sanctions on Turkey lifted and wanted these projects to come back. So sanctions can work, just that our sanctions on Russia have not had the impact we hoped they would. The Russian sanctions on Turkey had the impact that they hoped they would, and Turkey has reoriented back towards this relationship with Russia. So for Ukraine, as you can see from this map here, if these energy projects come to fruition as they are expected to do, so the first 2 lines of the Turkish Stream are expected to be done in 2018. They expect to have Nord Stream hopefully completed by the same point. Ukraine now goes from being a transit state for Russian energy to now having to find where it's going to get its energy from. And it may still get it from Russia, but it will get it at a much higher cost and getting it from Central European suppliers who will be sending it back to Ukraine vis-a-vis the Central European connectors. This will be a major geoeconomic shift of relations between Russia and Ukraine. because the Russians are working to essentially say Ukraine is unreliable. We are going to cut Ukraine out as a bridge between us and the West. Similarly, by the way, with what we're seeing in Crimea, here's the Kerch Peninsula. So initially, to get to Crimea, you had to go this way. By 2020, the rail and road links and energy links between the Russian mainland here and Crimea will be done. So Crimea will effectively be integrated to the Russian mainland without having to go through Ukrainian territory. Also, one of the things which a lot of people have not focused as much on with the question of Crimea, we obviously have spent a lot of time looking at the military dimension, is there are some nice oil and gas fields in the water here that Ukraine bungled in developing for 20 years because each government in Kiev, you had too many greedy hands that wanted to be paid off. And so rather than getting companies in there that could have been developing Ukraine's offshore oil and gas fields, say, circa 1999, no one went in to do it because it was not seen as feasible. And so now Russia has taken Crimea. No one is going to develop those fields on behalf of Ukraine. And while Crimea is under sanction from Western companies, so the EU and the US have sanctions which will prohibit our companies from doing any business in Crimea, there are other companies around the world that are not so similarly bound by those types of sanctions. So the possibility is not only does Russia get the benefit of Crimea's strategic advantages for the Black Sea, but Russia may end up reaping the energy rewards from the Black Sea as well. So Ukraine will lose in that way, not only losing transit income that it will lose when Russia stops shipping energy through Ukraine, but will lose the ability to gain its own energy independence because now it no longer controls those offshore zones. All right. A couple other things that the Russians are doing that have both geoeconomic and geostrategic importance. The Russians studied and have studied very closely what happened with Iran in terms of sanctions. So how, and Tim talked a little bit this morning about Iranian politics and new Iranian president and nuclear deal and leading to sanctions removal and the like. So the Russians studied how and why Iran was sanctioned, and their conclusion on that has been Iran was sanctionable because although it was an important commodity producer, it produced oil and natural gas, it was not indispensable. It could be sanctioned, and it could be sanctioned at some short-term cost, but that countries over time would accept that they could eat that short-term cost. So India, which traditionally got a lot of energy from Iran, we were able to induce India not to completely stop buying oil and gas from Iran, but to reduce. Every year we said, can you reduce a bit more? Can you reduce a bit more? Can you find some alternate suppliers? Japan, Korea, can you reduce your purchases from Iran? Because oil and gas, particularly oil and now gas with liquefied natural gas, are fungible commodities. Doesn't matter where it comes from. As long as you have, you can blend. If you need a particular grade, you can blend it. You don't need it to come from only one location. So we were able to put some degree of economic pressure on Iran we didn't buy oil from Iran, Europeans stopped buying oil and gas from Iran, and then our Asian partners we induced to lower their purchases. We were able to expel Iran for a time from the international financial system because Iranian participation in that system was not indispensable for the financial system to function. If we cut Iranian banks off from the international financial system, we didn't really risk much. So the Russian conclusion on sanctions on Iran was that Iran was vulnerable because it allowed itself to be too confident that because it produced oil and gas, you couldn't put pressure on them. And what you really have to do if you want to be more sanctions resistant in the future is you have to make yourself indispensable to the global economy. You have to make it so that whoever sanctions you has to be willing to take a lot of pain themselves. And this is the lesson of their sanctions that they applied against the Turks, which was that they caused some pain for Russia, a lot more pain for Turkey. And then the Turks caved. So that if you want to make yourself more sanctions resilient, you have to make yourself more indispensable. And one of the ways that the Russians are doing this is to begin to look at making Russia an indispensable node in the global economy. So, John, you always have the 70, 80, 90 paradigm. The Russians, being good classic Eurasian geopoliticians, want the revenge of land, right? So they want to find way, but not completely sea, but they don't completely lose the sea angle to it, but really to develop the land angle of connecting these two main engines of the global economy, East Asia and Europe. And that these two parts of the global economy, if you can set up land routes that are faster, cheaper, more efficient than the sea routes, you can cut time for delivery of a container ship going from Dalian in China, or from Seoul, or from Japan, going all the way around, and say, we can send you through the land route. Then why don't you think about doing that? It's very much part of the pitch to Japan is, Japan, integrate yourself here and then connect that way. Russia also, paying homage to the need for sea, says, well, now that the northern route is opening up, you want Russia to be the indispensable country that keeps that northern route open, keeps it safe, keeps it secure. So you need Russia to play that role. So you want Russia to have this position so that if in the future people say, let's cut Russia out of the equation, you're going to say, well, it's going to be difficult. If we're using Russia as our transport partner, if we're relying on Russia to integrate markets and to be this intermediary between these two major economic engines. North-South transport corridor. A lot of movement in the last year, ever since sanctions on Iran were lifted. Iran is now trying to lock things in place prior, if they believe, particularly based upon some early signals from the Trump administration, that the United States might seek to reimpose sanctions on Iran. You want to lock Iran into this network as well. So the North-South transport corridor for South Asia, that your booming markets, things here, go through Iran, Azerbaijan, Russia, and then you connect to your European markets. So President Aliyev of Azerbaijan was just in Iran 2 weeks ago. The rail lines are being connected. They're looking at energy deals between Russia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. There's been talk. Right now it's still very much in the drawing board about a canal